Well, it's the appointed time, and hopefully everybody can hear me well enough. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Neil Giles. I'm the CEO of Traffic Analysis Hub, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first ever Traffic Analysis Hub Intelligence Community Conference. Hold on to that thought of an intelligence community, please. It's entitled, It's the Economy Stupid? I've happily plagiarized President Clinton's words because I think they're pretty timeless, and they do very much apply to the world that we're about combating. The Hub is, of course, the richest store of survivor stories, with a community of almost 100 organizations around the world drawing on analysis and insights from that hub and beginning to contribute to the material that's there. Traffic Analysis Hub is a standalone cross-sector initiative developed with IBM with the pro bono assistance throughout of Clifford Chance, the global law firm. And please excuse the ambulance that's going by me in the office here in London. They're always very kind and timely. The objective of the Hub is to bring diverse data sets together for tailored analysis so that every actor in every sector has the opportunity to identify their vulnerabilities and take the opportunity to undermine the economic fundamentals that sustain human trafficking and exploitation in its widest possible sense. So over the next couple of hours, we're going to be listening to conversations surrounding this errant economy that sustains trafficking. We'll be hearing from thought leaders about the effective tools that there might be to undermine it and the importance of harnessing the intelligence potential that emerges from bringing together survivor experience and developing an analysis and insights therefrom. With 2 sessions, each beginning with a keynote speaker. And I'm massively grateful to those speakers, to the panel hosts, and to friends and connections that I've met from over a number of years now working in this sector who've agreed to speak at this afternoon's conference. To begin with, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Roberto Rigebone from MIT Sloan School of Management. He's an economist and a genius. He's having to speak to us via video this afternoon because he's having a hospital procedure that precluded his personal attendance. But it is my pleasure to introduce Roberto to you. And after his remarks, we'll be moving into our first panel. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the invitation to be part of this conference. It is a great pleasure for me to be here. Unfortunately, I had a medical appointment that it was impossible for me to move at the time of the keynote speech, so I'm really sorry I cannot participate. Still, I wanted to congratulate your tremendous effort for everything that you are doing. I think human trafficking is one of the most understudied and misunderstood problems that we have, and therefore thank you so much for all your efforts in this regard. Every time I talk about human trafficking, I kind of put my econ hat and I talk about international trade of humans or the market of human trafficking. And most people, when they hear me say that, they react very badly. Mostly, they have a moralistic view of human trafficking, and they say, rightfully so, that there should be no market, that we should not be trading human beings. And even though I agree with that position, the fact is that there is a market, a well-functioning market with a demand and supply that has prices that governs the transactions that are there. So I know this sounds heartless, but the fact is that if we don't think about human trafficking as a market, it's hard to understand what is the role that we play. Most people that are not in law enforcement feel that human trafficking is a problem that is really far from them. So first, I think that they are outraged by the fact that we still have modern slavery in our time in history. Second, they are overwhelmed by the size, the level of activity, and the profits that these criminal organizations make. And third, they feel that they can do very little to solve the problem. Furthermore, I think that they believe that they are not part of the problem at all. That implies that most consumers tend to be disconnected from this activity. In the end, this attitude implies that people are relying on law enforcement and on regulation to solve the problem. I feel that firms, NGOs, and consumers are, at the end of the day, are bystanders. In fact, maybe outraged bystanders, but nonetheless, they are not actually helping. I think this can be changed. I think that consumers will like to purchase goods that are low cost, high quality, and legally produced. So all three of them. However, as a consumer, we mostly pay attention to the first two because they are verifiable, while we actually hope that somebody else takes care of the third one. So after all, we buy and observe the prices, we experience the quality, and therefore it's kind of hoping that somebody, some institution, make sure that that product was legally produced. But because those institutions are failing, it is not surprising that many firms in a very competitive environment end up taking shortcuts, and they do whatever it takes to reduce the cost and increase the quality. So not surprising, some of the supply chain firms end up using human trafficking as part of their production. I think that consumers could help in the resolution if we had proper disclosure. Consumers will not be happy if a shirt was produced by a slave or a shrimp was deveined by an abusive organization. I think that will be unacceptable, and most consumers actually will react to that. I think it's time to provide the proper information so they can act. That has to be the network of enforcers that we need to rely on in order to be able to solve this problem. In that regard, firms, NGOs, and law enforcement have a very important role to produce information that consumers will end up using in the end. First, firms can understand their supply chains better, and in fact, most of the time, supply chains are understood only 2 degrees of separation. So in other words, firms know their suppliers, they might know the suppliers of the suppliers, but usually ends there. We don't have a very good quality verification farther down the supply chain. I do believe that this can be improved. Firms, and especially multinationals, can produce information and disclose information internationally about the quality of the labor practices in all the supply chain. That will mean that it will have an impact in their operations, especially if something inappropriate is found. But I believe that they have the ability to force the supply chain to disclose. I think that law enforcement and international organizations have very little chance to do so. Maybe a regulator can request firms to disclose that properly, but except for that, I think that our ability to gather the information on the whole supply chain through regulation is naive at best. We need to recruit the firms to do so. Second, NGOs and the production of data. We need to share more data. I have found it amazingly frustrating that every time we're trying to actually gather data from NGOs, they don't share. They don't share the data. They still have the 1970s mentality that the value is in the data. That is incorrect. The value is in the insights that you get. And in fact, when I teach the MIT students, I always say that linking data produces insights. Detached and isolated data produces anecdotes. NGOs are full of anecdotes, and I understand those anecdotes are important to gather funding, but we need to solve the problem. And in fact, if we are going to be effective, we need to share that data and produce better measurement. It's impossible to manage something that is badly measured. It's impossible. So I think that we can play a very important role, law enforcement and NGOs. We need to create a depository of data that can be used by researchers, law enforcement, and NGOs to produce better insights about how this market works. Again, if we think about this as a market, we will understand that every NGO has a disconnected piece of the puzzle. And by gathering all of those, we will be able to at least assess better what is the impact of the actions that we take. So that's my challenge to all of you, that firms learn and supervise their own supply chains much better and disclose that information in a way that can help us, all of us, understand this terrible problem better, that NGOs and law enforcement share the data in a way that we can get better insights about what is happening, and finally, that consumers, we do our homework and express our values or our dissatisfaction through our choices and expenses that we perform. I think we can build an army. Let's just do it. Thank you so much for the time, and thank you so much for this effort. Again, hope to see you next year.
Thank you, Roberto. Thanks very much. Really wise words and very interesting indeed. My name is John Cusack. I'm a board member and trustee of the Traffic Analysis Hub. I'm also chair of the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime. In this next 40-minute session, we've got 4 distinguished guests who are going to talk about all things human trafficking, but really pick up on a lot of Roberto's thoughts there. This session really is intending to think about how human trafficking works in a market context, and also explore a lot of the things that we think we know, but also try to understand what is it we don't know and what we need to know in order to move forward. What it is we are doing that's working well, but also what should we be doing more of, and what's stopping us from doing that is an important area of focus for us. If the true purpose of fighting financial crime is to reduce the harms that come from financial crime, then I don't think that there should be a higher priority than dealing with human trafficking. Unfortunately, I don't think that is the purpose, or at least the shared agreed purpose in what we're trying to achieve yet. But we are working towards moving and shifting that into that particular direction. And it'll be interesting to hear what our panelists think about the relative priority that human trafficking plays in the broader context. But let me first come to introduce our really distinguished, excellent panel of 4 panelists today. First up is Megan Lundstrom, is co-founder and director of research at the Avery Center for Research and Services. Megan, welcome. Megan, tell us just quickly about the Avery Center, if you would.
Hello, everyone. So great to be here. The Avery Center is based in Colorado, in the US, and we provide both research and services. So our vision is that lived experience must inform change. And so that goes back to this belief that those of us, myself included, who hold lived experience with human trafficking should be the leading experts that are informing what is needed in this field. So we have direct services that are available at no cost to individuals currently experiencing exploitation and who are exiting and rebuilding after exploitation. But we also really believe that we want to get upstream and figure out what's happening, why is it happening, and how do we stop it from happening? And that's where our research arm comes in. And so we are very busy more on the looking at true prevention of this issue and eradicating it in the future.
Thanks, Megan. And that's a real wonderful connection, isn't it, between real world engagement and also research into the subject. That connectivity there, I think, will be really helpful to explain to people listening today how real this is and how close we need to be to these things to understand them well. Matt Friedman is a long-time anti-human trafficking advocate, and he's CEO of the Mekong Club, which many of us have heard about. Matt, but why don't you tell us, for those that haven't, about the Mekong Club?
Mekong Club works with the private sector in a positive, supportive way to help them to understand the issue of modern slavery and what they need to do to address it. So we give them awareness raising, the basic tools, the basic consultations that they need in order to look at whether it's a bank or a manufacturer, retailer, or hospitality organization, so they can address the problem themselves.
And I came across you guys probably 6, 7 years ago. Matt, how long have you been going on the Mekong Club? Probably before that, right?
It started in 2012.
Okay, excellent. And then for the record, you're based in Hong Kong, yeah?
I am.
Okay, lovely, Matt. We'll get into that. Okay, next up, Nick Lewis. Nick, are you there?
Hi, John.
Hey there. Nick is Managing Director at Standard Chartered Bank and running what I think we used to call I3, Nick. Still called I3?
I3 is part of the portfolio, but now we're known as the high risk client unit now.
Okay. Well, you can explain more about that. But from his senior role at Standard Chartered, including tackling human trafficking. Before that, Nick was a senior law enforcer focused on organized crime, both in the UK and also outside of the UK, especially in the US and the Caribbean. Nick, you probably don't tell too many people about Standard Chartered Bank. They probably know what it is, but quick intro.
Thank you, John. I think the important thing to say about Standard Chartered is that the nature of our geographical footprint. We're present in countries which are considered to be source, transit, and destination countries in the human trafficking trade. And because we are based in local communities, our history and our genesis is in the communities of Africa and Asia. We have a big interest in protecting the communities and the family members of our clients and our customers. And one of the mantras of Standard Chartered Bank is to work in partnership to fight financial crime. And so much of the work that my team and I do is actually building partnerships, building intelligence and information sharing networks, and using the power that the financial sector can add to an intelligence picture to tackle specific problems. And human trafficking obviously is one of our top priorities.
Thanks, Nick. And last but not least, Theresa Forbes. Theresa, are you there? Theresa comes to us from the US Treasury, from the Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, with a particular focus on human trafficking. Theresa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you. Yes, I come from the United States Department of Treasury, where really our mission in our office is really to protect the US financial system from abuse. And my team really is looking at financial transparency issues. And I have the honor and privilege to working on human rights and corruption and environmental crimes. And with all three of those issues definitely have linkages to human trafficking. And I specifically focus on human trafficking policy related to anti-money laundering and financial crimes, and using economic tools to deter and detect abuse of the financial system by human traffickers, and also how we can use financial tools to help support those vulnerable populations as well as survivors. Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me here.
Wonderful. Now, the only downside of this panel is we've only got 40 minutes and probably 35 minutes left, so we're going to be really quick and get into it. Matt, to you first. Roberto talked about this as a marketplace, which we don't like to talk about people, especially suffering in this area as a market, but let's just do that for a second with the recognition that we're all focused very much on reducing harms. I'm told it's a 40 million global market. I'm told it's $150 billion big. I'm told it's got lots of different elements to it, and these different in different places, and the largest market's probably in Asia. What should we make of those numbers? Are they anywhere near right? Do we know where they come from? What's your sense of the size and shape of this thing? And can you help us with the confidence levels around some of those things?
Well, thank you for that question. My history of this goes all the way back to 1986. I was working on this topic back in New York City, even before it had a name. But the interesting thing about the data is that during that particular time, there was no data. In fact, there wasn't any data from 1986 to 1999 in terms of any kind of estimates. The first estimates we started to see were about the year 2000, when the TIP report was beginning to be put in place. Back then, it was about 18 to 36,000 were the numbers that were being used. And then over the years, the numbers jumped up to about 200,000 to 400,000. And it wasn't until 2012 that we saw the 21 million figure. And that was put out by ILO. They did some calculations, and that was kind of the standard for some time. Then Walk Free came along and decided that they wanted to do additional estimates. They collected a variety of different types of data, and we saw some kind of jumping numbers. It went up to 36 million. and I think that was 2014. Then it went up to 45.8 million. And the number that we have now is 40 million. I'll talk about that in a minute. But during the time that I was working in Asia, we saw some crazy numbers. Like, for instance, there was 500,000 children were estimated to be entering into modern slavery a year in Thailand, which, if you look at the statistics, it's just impossible to imagine that that would be a real number. But for a long time, numbers were used for advocacy purposes, for fundraising, and various other things. So this 40.3 million number came about as a result of an organization called Walk Free in Australia, linking with ILO and IOM. They had separate figures for a while. They decided to come together. They analyzed data from 54 databases, 71,000 interviews, lots of consultations, and they came up with this number, 40,300,000. And that's kind of been the stable number for a while. I anticipate there will be another number that will come out sometime in the next year or so. But for now, the importance of that particular number is that although we know it's not perfect, who can estimate clandestine numbers like this? We do recognize that it gives us kind of a baseline, a sense of where we are starting from. It helps us to advocate the relative size of what we think the numbers might be. And it helps us to give us a sense of kind of what's happening in various countries, which countries appear to have more human trafficking than others, or whether using human trafficking or modern slavery, whatever terminology you're using. Up until that time, a lot of the NGOs didn't understand the importance of having data. I always felt like it was relevant and important because I came from the public health discipline. In public health, you have numbers for everything. You couldn't even think about making a plan or a strategy without having some kind of data. But what's happening now is we're kind of moving in the direction that data is considered to be relevant, important, and necessary. And that's a really good place for us to be. And you'll hear a lot about that as we get into this discussion of the TA Hub. But, you know, even the 40 million, I think, is low. And the reason why I say that is I lived in Bangladesh for 5 years. And during the time that I was there, the ease at which a person can enter into modern slavery is amazing. Person makes $2 a day, never going to make more than $2 a day. All of a sudden, he needs $10 for medicine. He borrows the money. That debt then becomes $15. How is he going to pay it back? He'll never be able to do it. He has to live on the $2 a day. And so many people get trapped in this indebtedness situation. It's debt bondage. It happens all over the world. So, you know, 40 million is a big number, but it's probably a lot bigger than that. When it comes to the 150 billion number that we're seeing, that number was initially 32 billion. It came out in 2011 and people were really shocked and surprised that the number was there. They did a recalculation and it jumped up to 150 billion. Now, to put that number into perspective, that means that the traffickers collectively are making about $17 million an hour, or about $285,000 a minute. So we're really talking about a tremendous amount of profit that's being generated from this particular area. So what we're dealing with here is numbers that, for the most part, people could argue against, but at least it gives us a starting point. It gives us a platform to work from. Over time, I hope we will have better data. Certainly the TA Hub will contribute to us being able to move in that direction. And as a result of that, I think that the future of kind of intelligence related to modern slavery is going to continue to get better and better.
Thanks, Matt. That's really helpful. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, the numbers, as I understand them, that 40 and the 150. I mean, the 40 is broken down by a number of different elements, right? Human trafficking is made up of forced labor. It's made up of sexual exploitation. It's made up of illegal organ trafficking and forced marriage and what have you. One of the numbers I have is 5 million for sexual exploitation out of the 40. But it represents about 90 billion of the 150. Is that right, or does that sound right to you?
Who really knows? Actually, I think if you were to go deeper into supply chains and look at the amount of money that's being generated as a result of forced labor, I think the number would be significantly higher. In fact, I've heard recently numbers as high as 280 billion a year, and I was on a webinar this afternoon that somebody said it was $500 billion. The bottom line is this: there is a lot of illegal, there is a lot of illicit, there is a lot of modern slavery related crime that's taking place. And as a result of that, And as a result of it being hidden, it's really hard for us to estimate or guesstimate. But I think gradually over time, we'll be able to uncover more of this as the financial institutions get more involved in addressing this. And we're seeing that trend take place as we speak.
But I think the answer there is to uncover as much as we can, and then we'll learn more, right? So over to you, Megan. What's your take on this? And in particular, one thing that's always struck me is this whatever the number is, 40 or 100 or 20, this is not a static number, right? People are coming into this market, unfortunately, and also thankfully leaving it. And you're seeing some of the people leave it. So talk a little bit about what you're seeing and also the sort of nature of how we get people out of this thing.
Oh, I couldn't have said it better than Matt, especially at that global level. I think just from the research that the Avery Center has done here in the United States, looking at prevalence, we primarily serve individuals who are experiencing sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation, fully acknowledging that there are individuals who experience an overlap in sexual and labor exploitation at the same time or one after the other. Our research, we have always taken a demand reduction approach. So looking at consumers, and what we know here in the United States, based on studies over the last several decades, is that at least 5% of the adult male population has purchased commercial sex at some point in the last year. And so when we kind of back into these economic models looking from a demand perspective, and we know that here in the United States, individuals who are experiencing sex trafficking are forced to engage in approximately 10 transactions per day. So when you start to work these numbers out and then you look at the financial impact of that, knowing that the average daily quota is between $500 and $1,000 US per day, those numbers become astronomical very quickly. So I think that, I think as Matt said, it's great to have some estimates so that we have kind of like a general compass of what direction we need to head and the enormity of this issue. But when we really start to drill down into things, I don't think we have any concept of how enormous this issue is, how many people are affected, and particularly how large the cash flows are of it. I think the other piece that's really interesting to think about the economic component, these cash flows. Some types of exploitation generate cash flows, so they're going to be traceable. You're going to see direct indicators of money laundering or illicit funds moving through systems, but you're also going to see other forms of exploitation where cash flow is not directly generated, it's more saved by the company or the business owner or the employer by withholding wages. And so we cannot possibly know the impact of this issue and how much money should be going to the people who are working but are not receiving that money. So I also, from that direct service side of things and victim services, what we know is, at least at the Avery Center, and I would assume that it's pretty much across the board, all forms of exploitation, and all agencies and NGOs will likely see the same thing. But at the Avery Center, 100% of the individuals that we serve who are exiting are under the poverty line at the point of exit. And that's simply because they've lost their revenue source. And so as Matt touched on, there's vulnerable populations who are already living below the poverty line or have one catastrophic financial event that pushes them into this place of financial vulnerability. And so when we're looking at ensuring successful long-term exit for survivors, we need to be looking at addressing poverty as one of those critical risk factors for re-exploitation in the future.
Okay, and Megan, when you're seeing survivors then, I mean, I'm told, I mentioned this figure earlier with Matt, this sort of 20% throughput of trafficking victims until they come out, which suggests a 5-year average slavery period, which which who knows whether that's right, sexual exploitation anyway, at least. Is that anywhere near the marker, or do you have any evidence for this?
I'm glad you asked that, because we are currently working on a collaborative research project with several survivors. It was a completely survivor-developed, survivor-driven, and survivors provided input into this research project. So it's been really exciting to be a part of that process. But one of the things that we found, particularly with commercial sexual exploitation, is that at least for the sample that we had, which was 130 individuals across the US, the average length of their trafficking experience was 9 years. With definitely, absolutely kind of a concentration around that 5-year point. But when you factor in individuals specifically who are trafficked through their families, sometimes as early as birth, you're going to see these longer periods of exploitation as they are trafficked their entire childhood sometimes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Come back to you shortly, Megan. Nick, so you don't cover just human trafficking. Of course, you're worried about lots of different crimes. Where does human trafficking fit into the crimes of concern as you see them as they present themselves to a bank like Standard Chartered?
Thanks. Yes, John. I mean, there is no sort of real simple answer to that question, and in fact, the challenge you raise is it's not even a single question. It's a whole host of issues all rolled into one. I guess first of all, I would even challenge the description of human trafficking as an economic crime. It's a sinister and pernicious crime which generates profit, and it's what is done with the profit that is the economic crime. And that might sound a little bit pedantic, but it's important, particularly in the context of financial institutions, because we're required by law to look for and report our suspicions as they pertain to the proceeds of crime. And that sort of, by definition, means that we're putting our energy and our effort to comply with our legal obligations at the wrong end of the crime continuum. The crime's already been committed. The victims have already been trafficked and exploited by the time the financial institutions begin to discharge their obligations. And so the intelligence value that we can bring to tackling the problem is limited to what we do voluntarily rather than what we do through our mandatory obligations. Secondly, I think it's impossible and frankly quite dangerous to try and rank crimes in any sort of particular order based on the profit margin. Our host, Dr. Traffik and Mekong and various others will tell us, in fact, Matt has already said, it's almost impossible to calculate with any certainty how big this problem is. And if the calculation that $150 billion is made from human trafficking every year, then that's certainly less money than some crimes, and it's more money than others. But if profit generated is the driving factor that sets the priority, then human trafficking is not going to get the attention that it deserves. And clearly, the harm that's caused by crime is a really important factor in that equation. And then by any measure, I think human trafficking would move up the scale. So regardless of how unreliable the figures are, I think that we need to be cautious about driving any sort of prioritization matrix by reference to the profits. I think that human trafficking is already well prioritized in some areas of response. Many governments around the world include human trafficking in their sort of security and their law enforcement priorities. Most developed countries recognize harm as a factor in that equation, and therefore identification and liberation of slaves and trafficking victims is a high priority response. But it is a response to known events. It's not a high priority in the proactive collection of intelligence, the identification and dismantling of the networks before the trafficking begins. It's not a preventative priority, it's an enforcement priority. And there's a number of different challenges, as we know. Domestic governments make it hard to prioritize engagement across international borders. In the case of following the money and tracing proceeds of crime, that's probably our hardest domain to operate in, and particularly when we look at a number of the countries which are high-risk jurisdictions from a human trafficking perspective, underpinned by corrupt regimes and corruption and kleptocracy, underpins and in some cases enables these crimes to flourish. So it's a difficult and complex environment to work in. So I think the real challenge is how do we coordinate it better rather than challenge where it is in the prioritization scale. And a lot of people think it's really easy for it must be really easy for banks to find the dirty money. Well, it isn't. It is really difficult. All of our frameworks are set up, as I said, to identify proceeds. More and more work is being done by industries, including the financial industry, to raise awareness and to share information and intelligence to improve our knowledge of red flags, so that we can understand the detail that sits behind some of these crimes, which then makes it easier for us to play our part. We need the prioritization piece. We need for it to be an intelligence priority across the full spectrum of players. We need to get to a position where instead of gathering information about the proceeds of crime as we do in the anti-money laundering environment, I think we need to consider the parallel with the counter-terrorist financing environment, where we have similar obligations, but our obligations in that domain are to try and ever stop the money getting to the terrorist organizations to fund their activities. And if we approached some of these really serious crimes like human trafficking from that perspective, and we were looking at how we can use our intelligence and our analytical capability and our global perspective of financial movements to tackle the logistics of human trafficking rather than the proceeds of human trafficking, I think we could be much more successful. And that's why partnerships with people like Stop the Traffic are really important to us, because the contribution that they make, and all the other panelists that have spoken as well, to understanding the context in which the transaction that we're looking at appears, that's the real detail that differentiates whether a transaction is truly suspected of being connected to crime, or whether it's just somehow anomalous and unusual when compared to all the other transactions in an account. And working with people like Stop the Traffic and the contribution that many other agencies make to their work, entities like Red Compass put together these really detailed analyses of typologies that enable us, and hopefully will enable us in the future, to really break down all the different elements of behavior in a human trafficking chain. And from our perspective, what we need to understand is how money behaves differently at each different stage of the chain. It's no good us only looking at the end when the criminal is trying to clean up the money so they can go and buy the nice house or the smart car.
So let's look at that. We're going to look at that in part two, albeit it's going to be a short part two. But Theresa, it sounds to me as when I was listening to Nick there, I would imagine you would agree with a lot of that, but it'd be interesting from a US government perspective. What's your take on that?
On the sense of the priority of the issue, I think that's definitely been not only just human trafficking in general, but that illicit finance, addressing money laundering and proceeds of human trafficking is definitely becoming more increasing, because we've seen a shift too from treating human trafficking as just a transnational organized crime issue to treating it as a human rights issue, to also looking at how dynamic human trafficking is and how it intersects with other issues that we're taking a look at. Like environmental crimes, for example. I recently saw the Financial Action Task Force in their new report on addressing money laundering and environmental crimes talk about how human trafficking is happening in the context of illegal mining or illegal logging and some of these other crimes. So I think that shift in mindset has been, it's important. We've also seen prioritization of the issue because we're addressing it not from priority because of the harm or the amount of proceeds, but the way we look at things is by addressing risks. And so within our own national money laundering risk assessment, we had identified human trafficking as one of the top money laundering risks in the United States. And everyone is doing their own kind of risk-based approach, looking at their own risk and assessments, and that's what we had found. So then based off of that, this year we had just put out our anti-money laundering priorities, which really were similar to what we put as our risks when we were analyzing that, looking at corruption, human trafficking, transnational organized crime, those issues. And so we're even seeing in the anti-money laundering space prioritization of this issue because of the risks. We've also seen countries kind of coming together recently as well, not just the United States, but others within the G7, for example, highlighting the importance of addressing forced labor. We've seen Canada, the United States, the EU, and the UK in March take sanctions actions together against forced labor. And then just this month, the United States issued a business advisory on forced labor, and so did the European Union. So it really does show how the global community, not just the United States, is continuing to prioritize this issue generally, as well as an illicit kind of finance, illicit crimes angle, anti-money laundering angle as well. So I think that's been really important, because one of the things that we're aiming to do is use financial information to not only kind of stop the profits after exploitation has happened and the crime has happened, but also using financial intelligence to hopefully work backwards to be able to identify and to be able to identify networks and detect those who are engaging in human trafficking and profiting from it, to stop them from doing that. And then on the flip side, not only using financial tools to go after those bad actors, but how can we use financial tools and policies then to help address vulnerabilities on the ground that can lead to exploitation or re-exploitation. I think that's very important as well, to have that perspective, not only from a policy perspective, but we've seen it as well within the private sector too, with survivor inclusion initiatives as well, to help survivors get access to the banking industry, get access to things that they need to be able to build their lives again. So I think that's kind of how our prioritization has been working. This has been a priority issue for a long time, but it's how are we addressing it, and how are we looking at it from some nuanced angles as well, with intersections with corruption and other types of issues, and seeing this as a human rights issue. At the end of the day, it's causing harm, but we're also seeing that countries are also engaging in forced labor, and how can we stop and address that when it's coming from governments and not just transnational organized crime actors. So kind of taking that holistic approach, which it's complex, it's complicated, and that's one thing to help people understand it. It's not as simple as just looking at the word human trafficking. It's a crime of crimes. There are many ways that we can look at and address it. And so I think we all should be prioritizing it from our different perspectives, and then working together to address it from those perspectives to really be able to get at the issue. Because if you're only looking at it from one narrow perspective, it's very hard to then actually make a dent in what we're seeing in the numbers that you all had talked about.
Look, great, thank you, Theresa. Great, I was going to say initial comments, but as we've got sort of 6-7 minutes left, they're going to be the majority of the comments. I've got 3 things I'm going to throw out there, and I want your quick response. One is, when I read the tip, which I do every year, and the most recent one came out, it's still staggering to me. It's an incredible report, and the best that there is, but incredible to me how little prosecutions and convictions there are still around the world. It's tiny, absolutely tiny. Even for tier 1 countries, it's tiny. Second, I saw a report in the US where law enforcement congratulating themselves on arresting a whole bunch of people who've been exploited. Is that the way we still go with this? Are we still in that world where we're arresting people who are exploited? And thirdly, the roll-up of a European gang, an Albanian gang operating in Spain, showed me that actually all the money that was made in Spain was cash couriered back to Albania and banked in Albania and didn't go through the banking system. Those 3 things worry me, because they kind of undermine a little bit what we're all trying to achieve. Matt, why don't you take any one you want? Keep it really quick because we've only got sort of 5 minutes left. I want to get around the panel on whichever question you'd like to answer.
We'll do the math. If you have 40 million people and you're helping 108,000, that's 0.2% of the victims being helped. They estimate 500,000 criminals. They put what 7,000 in jail. That's 0.8%. You know, we're not even hitting a full percentage point. You know, the difficulty is, again, if tremendous profits are being made, and the amount of money that is being thrown at this is about 350 million, and we're not as strategic as we can be by taking data, analyzing, and using as intelligence and making that work for us, then we're making a lot of mistakes along the way.
Very good. Megan?
This is probably one of my favorite things to talk about, so I'll try to keep it super concise. We use economist Siddharth Kara's economic model to look at this issue here in the United States. And when we look at the cost of risk to a trafficker here in the United States right now, which is based on a series of formulas, and it is 6 o'clock in the morning here, so I am not going to get into those formulas because my brain is not quite up to speed yet. But suffice it to say, you look at the different components of the likelihood of being arrested, the likelihood of being convicted. Traffickers here in the United States, sex traffickers specifically, have a 0.0000027% chance of being arrested for any one of their forced, frauded, or coerced sex acts. And when you look at those formulas and like, why is that such a ridiculously small number? It comes down to the sheer volume of the demand for those forced, frauded, and coerced sex acts. And so I fully support law enforcement going after and arresting traffickers, and traffickers need to be held accountable in our court systems. And so do consumers, because they are fueling this issue. So I think that a lot of attention needs to be paid towards the demand for commercial sex as a means of increasing the cost of risk for traffickers.
Thank you, Megan. Theresa.
Thanks. I think with this as well, it's very, very challenging. One is because I think there's sometimes too a conflation for many, many years between human trafficking and human smuggling, particularly in the United States. That's one thing we've been trying to do, is help separate these issues, but also understand that a human smuggling situation can turn into an exploitative one because they're very vulnerable to that, and then turn into a trafficking situation. So you need to take that victim-centered approach, and really it takes more work than to analyze whether, okay, is this person now a victim that I'm looking at, and kind of taking, I think that victim-centered approach is very, very important, and we need to focus more on that. And then, as was discussed earlier, the survivor voices in this, and if we had more survivor voices in the work that we're doing, you'd be able to kind of see it from that lens a little bit more. So I think it's really, really important be able to have that kind of approach when you're taking it, whether it's from the law enforcement approach or any others, to really look at it kind of from holistically, from the whole person point of view. I've got a couple of resources that I'll just share in the chat, since I know we're running out of time, on some of the survivor voice, as well as what businesses and banks can do more on forced labor.
Thank you, Theresa. Last word over to you, Nick.
Thank you. I think two very brief comments given the amount of time. I think it's really dangerous for anybody, and especially law enforcement, to assume that the victims of trafficking are willingly engaged in the commission of crimes, even when they are involved in the commission of crimes. Very often they have absolutely no choice, and the hold that their traffickers have over them is absolutely something that must be taken into account when making those decisions about prosecution. And the second point, I think, very quickly, your point about cash, John. Europe presents a fairly unique environment in terms of cash, because a single currency across multiple countries enables cash to be generated through crime in one country and then physically transported and spent in another country, thus completely evading, if they so choose, the traditional financial system. But at some point or other, that money must enter the system. The criminals must put that money into the system, even if it's only to avoid being ripped off by other criminals or having it taxed or having it seized by the authorities. And the risk to the risk is that by not looking at that information, that cash deposit holistically, not understanding the context which we were talking about earlier, and ignoring the fact that that money may well have been generated in another country. That's the real risk, and that's what enables cash-based criminal economies to launder the proceeds, particularly in Europe, because that money, which could be Spanish euros, it could be predominantly euros passed in Spain, even printed in Spain, could be taken back to another European economy and spent very freely, and no questions would be asked about why Spanish euros were being spent in Ireland, for example. That's a particular challenge that we need to address.
Thanks very much, Nick, and thanks to everybody. In that case, the money's ended up in Albanian bank accounts. It shows that we're as strong as our weakest link, right? So yeah. Everything is joined up, and cash does end up coming into the system, not necessarily at the start, but we all need to be aware and keep our eyes and our ears open. Thanks very much, Nick. Thanks very much, Matt, Megan, and Theresa. Thank you very much indeed. And I hand over now to Sebastian.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. I hope you are enjoying the Traffic Analysis Hub Intelligence Community Conference. I'm Sebastián Arevalo Sánchez, the CEO of Fundación Pasos Libres and Latin Regional Representative for the Traffic Analysis Hub. I'm pleased to introduce to Laura Rodriguez and Juan Cepeda from Undermine, the winning team of the Data Jam Pasos Libres 2020, an international technological competition against modern slavery and an alternative learning scenario to educate the next generation of citizens capable of disrupting human trafficking and forced labor through innovation, entrepreneurship, and technology. Undermine has been working with Pasos Libres, the Traffic Analysis Hub, and IBM for the last 7 months to develop its data-driven solution that seeks to expose the link between websites that offer sexual services and human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation in Latin America. Without further delay, here is Undermine.
Hello everyone, my name is Juan Esteban and I'm part of Undermine, the winning team of Data Jam Pasos Libres Online 2020, organized by Fundación Pasos Libres and IBM. Our group consists of Laura Rodriguez, Cristian Pardo, Juan Pablo Gomez, and me, and we're happy to show you our solution, the witness. When we were participating in the Data Jam, we realized that there is not enough data and analytical insights about potential sexual exploitation activities on websites that offer sexual services in Colombia. The lack of that information makes it even more challenging to trace human trafficking online and its connections with the crime dynamics of life. Currently, the collection, processing, and labeling of valuable data from those websites is being done manually when specific investigations require it. Moreover, the collection of that information on a large scale faces privacy data restrictions and technical challenges such as IP blocking and the need to write a specific extraction algorithm for each website structure. So as Undermine, we created the Witness, a tool that uses web scraping in order to search, collect, and store information such as phone numbers, names, and locations from websites that offer sexual services in Colombia. The Witness seeks to provide a good quality structured data extracted from those websites to Colombian anti-trafficking organizations that can help analysts and investigators to identify relations and trends online linked to offline sexual exploitation activities. Right now, in 4 months of work, the Witness has collected more than 43,000 data points and analyzed information from 21,000 sexual services ads, extracting more than 4,000 locations and 120,000 pictures. It has helped to build graph with more than 4,000 nodes and 10,000 relations among them. The solution is also applying NLU processing to obtain extra information from how these ads are written and the comments that the clients make on them.
Now, let's take a look at the witness. With the witness, you can identify the top 10 most suspicious advertisements based on a score, which is built using different criteria such as the presence of keywords, the natural language processing features, which identify if the announcement is written in first plural person or in third person. Also, it takes into account the nationality of the person which the text is talking about. You can also see some stats about the natural language processing model, such as the entropy of the advertisements and how it is correlated with other features, such as the nationality or the form of the text. Finally, our tool also lets the user interact with the dashboard, which contains a map where the announcements are located, so that users can filter that information and see the results interactively. Now, let's take a look at the following presentation. You will see a knowledge graph, which consists of sets of different types of nodes. The blue dots represent advertisements. The yellow dots represent phone numbers. The green dots represent places, and finally, the red ones represent external websites. Now, let's take a closer look at one of these clusters. We can see several advertisements that are connected with the same phone number, which is a very suspicious cluster because usually every person who participates in the platform should have his or her own phone number. Also note that every ad in this cluster is connected to the same external website, and that cluster of announcements is connected to 3 different cities: Madrid, Mosquera, and Punza. With this kind of findings, we cannot say this cluster is related to the crime of human trafficking, but what we can say is that there are organizations participating on the website, and that at least one of them is working on those 3 cities. Another interesting example of those suspicious clusters, which shows several ads connected with the same Instagram account, is this one. Notice that with this data representation, we can easily identify all phone numbers that this organization currently uses. So finally, I want to talk to you about the future of the witness. In the short and middle term, the Alifmine team will first continue working with Fundación Pasos Libres, IBM, the Traffic Analysis Hub, Stop the Traffic, and deploy the witness to contribute to understanding and combating online sexual exploitation in Colombia and Latin America in partnership with other key stakeholders. Second, explore how the witness and its technical and theoretical basis can be applied to collecting and analyzing data from other forms of human trafficking online. And third, establish a sustainable business model to expand and scale the witness. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope to hear from you again.
Thank you very much, friends from Latin America. It's time for the second session this afternoon, and it's my privilege to introduce a friend and colleague for over 20 years, Sir Rob Wainwright, someone who went on from our time together in the UK's national agency to become the director of Europol and is now a senior partner with Deloitte, based in Holland. He is a truly international figure on the issue of intelligence and law enforcement, and it's a great privilege to have him keynote speech this second session. Over to you, Rob. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. And a keynote speech from a holiday location with unstable Wi-Fi. So I'm hoping you can hear me. And if so, I'll push on for the next 10 minutes. Thanks, Neil. And thanks also to Laura and Juan for sharing their innovative solution. Another example, we've heard many others, many contributions in the first panel as well, of why data matters in the fight against modern slavery. And I'm going to stay with that theme myself. As Neil says, I have some background in my career of being involved in intelligence work, in data-led response to different kinds of crime and terrorism. I'm also a board member of the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, and I've been a supporter and informal advisor of this great initiative, TAH Hub, since its foundation, actually, and all credit to Neil and his team for the work that they have done. So let's remind ourselves of the context of why TAH Hub, something like TAH Hub, is so important in the fight against human trafficking and modern slavery. It's really going right back to the start of our conference today, and some of the words that Roberto said, it's really about leveraging the power of data to increase our understanding of the problem. Everything comes from that. If we can understand better the nature of the problem, how it works, who's involved, where it intersects with the legitimate economy and indeed our normal lives, then of course we give ourselves a better opportunity to combat that problem. And as Roberto said, the key lies not just in the power of data itself, but of course in that latent power that data has in giving you insight to give you increased knowledge therefore that can give you the opportunity to drive a better response. In the law enforcement world, this is known as intelligence-led policing. I'm sure all of you have heard of that before. A concept really that was born, at least in the United Kingdom and in other parts of Europe since, born out of our urgent need to combat the problem of terrorism in our continent, across our continent now for many decades, a more urgent need, of course, within the last 5 to 10 years as a result of what we've seen. It's the cornerstone of an approach against counterterrorism, but also, as I saw through my work at Europol, it quickly became the cornerstone of how Europe as a whole is now combating other forms of serious crime, including, of course, modern slavery. And to give my own example from the days of Europol, we saw, I think, over the last 10 to 15 years, how the problem of modern slavery, alongside financial crime, terrorism, cyber, many others, how it was becoming a bigger problem for us in society. And at the heart of that bigger problem was the intrinsic nature of the way in which crime was changing, was becoming a globalized criminal economy. In fact, of course, leveraging the power of internet technologies and many others. They were transforming crime into a global concern. The development of global criminal syndicates, much more resourceful, much more enterprising, much more innovative in their means to attack us in different ways. The development of professional enablers in the field of financial crime and so many others, and also in the field of modern slavery. We saw at Europol, therefore, we have seen in other countries over the last decade, especially, this growth of a different kind of criminal problem. And for us to deal with that bigger challenge, we had to first understand it better. And if the intrinsic nature of it has become more cross-border in nature, that means that those involved with the responsibility to fight modern slavery and other forms of crime had to exchange data across borders to themselves become more globalized in their approach. And Europol, to give an example of how a data-led effect can work, built therefore an information sharing platform, not dissimilar actually to the architecture, the concept behind the TAH Hub, but on perhaps a bigger scale, connecting indeed over 1,000 law enforcement agencies and specialist teams from across Europe and indeed many other countries. And it's only when we did that and when we leveraged that insight from all that data that we collected on a single platform by using modern data analytical capabilities could we really see the true picture of the problem that we're trying to combat? And I can quite confidently say that without our doing that, we would have been in no position to do the work and indeed to support the many national law enforcement agencies around Europe to deal with the problems that then later became even greater, not least with the major terrorist attacks, the uptick in human trafficking, as well as people smuggling, the burgeoning volumes of financial crime and drugs trade as well, and of course, not to mention cybercrime as well. So it's the data network effect that's in work, indeed the same effect that we see in the business sector that's driven over a similar period, of course, the growth of some of the big tech firms like Amazon and Facebook. They too are leveraging exactly that, the power of connecting data from multiple sources in order to understand your business environment in a better way. And how does this work for human trafficking, modern slavery? Well, I think there still is a big issue in the deficit of our knowledge. We simply don't understand, as we were hearing in the first panel, even the size of the problem, how much criminal proceed is here. It's anyone's guess to a certain extent. We have some understanding of the typologies of the problem, which parts of the world perhaps are more affected than others. We have some understanding of the major perpetrators and some of the victims, but by no means the complete picture. We are some way short still of that. Now, TA Hub, of course, is helping to pull that together. At last count, 81 different organizations contributing their data to TA Hub, and that's already a sizable platform. Strength lies not just in the size, which is expanding all the time, but in the diversity of those sources. Law enforcement agencies, NGOs, survivors themselves bringing survivor experiences to bear, and the richness of that first-hand account to help us better understand the problem of modern slavery. So that's why I think TA Hub matters. I've kept my Wi-Fi by losing my voice, so I'll wrap up at that point and hope that my observations on why a data-powered response is fundamental to the way in which we deal with some of the biggest problems in society. That includes modern slavery and human trafficking. And that's why, for me, I'm delighted to have seen the growth and success of TA Hub following this concept that's been so successful elsewhere. And see that grow in recent years. I think it's great to see. It's wonderful to have so many people tuning in today and so many distinguished speakers joining me in this platform. So on that note, Neil, I'll hand back to you. And thank you all for listening to me today. And thank you, most importantly, for the partnership that you bring in the fight against human trafficking.
Thanks, Sir Rob. I'd like to proceed on now, and thanks to all the previous speakers. I'd like to proceed to welcome everybody to the second panel discussion today, which is discussing the value of diverse data sources, intelligence networks, and data systems. So it's very much a continuation of looking at the technology aspect of today's conversation around economics and the issue of human trafficking. My name is John Mcgrath. I'm a senior management consultant at IBM Ireland. I'm also the leader of IBM's Tech for Good team and the architect and delivery leader for the Traffic Analysis Hub technology. Now, throughout today, we've heard about the economics of human trafficking, and earlier speakers have touched on some common themes that we've heard throughout the last couple of years. The need for gathering high quality data to leverage the power of data to, as Sir Rob mentioned, to increase our understanding of the problem. The need for active data sharing and advanced analytics to help us gain insights into the scale and the patterns globally. And the need for multi-sectoral technology adoption and collaboration to most effectively disrupt the business of human trafficking. Now, on this panel, we'll discuss the opportunities and challenges that technology and data bring for organizations operating in various sectors. And with that in mind, I'd like to introduce some of our panelists. Today, I'm very fortunate to be joined by 4 experts, each with a unique perspective and representing different sectors. So I'll start today with Valdeci Urquiza, who is a commissioner at the Brazilian Federal Police and also serves as the Assistant Director of Vulnerable Communities at the Interpol General Secretariat in Lyon, France. He's previously worked as head of Interpol's National Central Bureau in Brazil Head of the International Police Cooperation Division, and Chief Information Officer of the Brazilian Federal Police. He holds a bachelor's degree in law, postgraduate diplomas in public administration from IBMEC University, in strategic sustainability management from PUC de Sao Paulo, and in criminal justice from the University of Virginia, and is also a graduate from the FBI National Academy 267 session in Quantico, Virginia. Whew, I got through all of that. That's quite a resume, Valerie. If I could start with you, I know from our previous conversations that in your role, both with the Brazilian Federal Police and Interpol, you have some experience in international collaborations, but especially relating to the adoption of technology and the use of data to disrupt many criminal activities around the world. Perhaps you could describe your experience of how national and international law enforcement agencies leverage technology resources to combat crimes such as human trafficking.
Hi, John. Thank you for this very kind introduction. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon to all of you. And please let me just start by congratulating John, Neil, and all the team at the Trafficking Analysis Hub for organizing this very nice event. And thanks for inviting Interpol to join this relevant debate today. John, I think your question touches on the core of policing activities today. Technology and the use of data are really the lifeblood of policing. As modern criminals continue to take advantage of the newest technologies, and they also discover innovative ways to act in our borderless society, I believe it's vital for law enforcement agencies to ensure that we can stay ahead of the criminals. And I believe that we can only achieve that through the adoption of new technologies, a wide use of information sharing mechanisms, and also the strong international police cooperation. At Interpol, we believe that a strong component of criminal analysis and intelligence sharing enhances this capability to investigate cases of people smuggling and human trafficking. We understand that it's our role as an international police organization to store and share information, including personal data, on criminal networks that work behind human trafficking and people smuggling activities. Interpol stores literally millions of records from law enforcement entities worldwide in different various criminal databases with the objective of identifying crime patterns and establishing links between perpetrators and investigations. By doing that, we can develop referrals, for example, intelligence reports, and provide that to our member countries so they can better target criminals and identify potential victims. Human trafficking investigations, this is a good example on how law enforcement can benefit from the use of this data and the new technologies. As we heard from some of the presenters on the first panel today, the criminal networks behind trafficking human beings, they operate as any other supply and demand business, using their victims as commodities that can be sold, rented, exchanged. And this supply and demand business, it leaves traces all along the chain from the point of the victim recruitment to the point of victim exploitation. So those traces are mixed in pools of data that we believe that can be analyzed and may lead law enforcement agencies to the traffickers and their victims. This can evolve in different forms of collaboration and even joint investigations and operational actions supported by the different specialized units, especially here at Interpol. So, however, we know that not all the relevant information to fight crime is always with law enforcement. That's why we seek to have a strong collaboration with many sectors that can support and join the fight against organized crime. Private sector partners play a key role in preventing, identifying, reporting suspected cases of human trafficking. And for this reason, we seek to engage and build a very strong relationship with the relevant institutions among the different sectors. In 2018, for example, Uber, represented here today by my good friend Nick, they were the first private sector partner to join Interpol's Human Trafficking Expert Group. We know from experience that the private sector typically holds more detailed data on threats, victims, than traditional law enforcement agencies. Information and best practice exchange between police and private industry is key, really, in developing a comprehensive global response. We understand that Interpol can serve as a global hub for this information flow between private sector and law enforcement agency. Working with the private sector help us bridge some gaps and provide vital services or expertise that would not otherwise be available to law enforcement agencies. We have some great opportunities for the application of technology and data to disrupt criminal networks on the law enforcement side of it. Products and services, for example, used in the human trafficking supply chain are more and more digitalized, making analysis easier than in the past. Machine learning and artificial intelligence is also so advanced today that it can be effectively in detecting, preventing, and combating human trafficking online. But we still have some difficult challenges ahead of us. The first one I could mention today is the lack of available data in some countries. The resources invested in the collection and analysis of data to combat human trafficking in the countries that are most affected by it are still not sufficient in most of the cases. And I think that TA Hub is playing a very critical role in filling this gap. Another challenge that could be mentioned today is the ever-evolving environment. As you know, traffickers adapt easily and they make their moves faster than ever. COVID-19 is only a proof of this, and where we started to see human trafficking moving many of their operations to the online environment, reducing the possibilities to be detected, especially in the countries where cyber patrolling is still in a very premature stage. And finally, John, just to finalize, I think that we also have the challenge on how to scale the initiatives that have proven to be effective. And again, TA Hub is, I believe, filling this gap and doing a fantastic job in providing data and analytical tools to some of the partners in the fight against trafficking human beings. Back to you, John.
No problem, Valdeci. And time permitting, we will come back to the opportunities and the challenges that technology present to us. I want to dip a little bit into the collaboration with the corporate world. And we're very fortunate to have Nick Palethorpe with us today. So Nick is a UK native. He's now based in Toronto, in Canada. He leads the law enforcement operations team for Uber Canada. And he has responsibility for growing the awareness of Uber's law enforcement services externally and also working cross-functionally with internal teams to support investigations, data privacy, process improvements, and policy development. Now, prior to this, he spent 3 years in Europe developing Uber's relationship with multiple stakeholders, from law enforcement to intergovernmental organizations, NGOs, and anti-trafficking bodies. He studied criminology and history at university and served 10 years as a detective in the London Metropolitan Police, where he worked across specialist commands and eventually specialized in cybercrime. He currently sits on, as Valdeci mentioned, Interpol's expert human trafficking group, the International Association of Chiefs of Police Public and Private Partnership Committee, and he's also recently joined onto the advisory committee of Project iRise, which is a survivor-led community-based NGO in Toronto. Now, I'm delighted to have you on the panel with us today, Nick, and it's probably just my inner geek that comes out every now and again, but Uber's famous for its use of technology and data to disrupt and redefine a traditional business model. So I'm very interested to hear you tell us a little bit about the Uber approach in terms of using technology and disparate data sources and analytics in combating human trafficking.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. Yes, Uber, I think we should go back to the basics, is a global company. We operate in over 10,000 cities in the world, and 70 plus countries, moving millions of people every day, whether that's trips occurring from an airport, taking you there to a hotel, to a place of work, to your home, and then to ordering food. I think since the pandemic, our Uber Eats business has grown considerably. And so now you are able to sit at home, press a button and get food, groceries, or even in some countries, pharmacies delivered directly to you. As a result of that, there are millions of drivers out there on the road who see things, who hear things, and who have a critical role, we believe, in helping to disrupt trafficking. And I think we, as a transportation company who are doing all of that, see that we have that unique position to try and find ourselves in a position to actually try and move the needle on trafficking and see how we can disrupt it in some shape or form. And the ways in which we're doing that, to answer your question, I'm going to sort of look at like the data part and then the tech part. From the data part, as you mentioned, I sit on the law enforcement operations team. We have a team of ex-law enforcement detectives or investigators who are based in different parts of the world, and who are engaging proactively with law enforcement to make sure that they are fully educated and aware of how we can assist them whenever there is an investigation. Now, obviously, those investigations can take shape in different means and different forms, and one of those could be human trafficking. So we are out there as a team proactively engaging with human trafficking investigators, making sure that they are fully aware how they can reach out to us, how they can work with our legal team, with our privacy team, submit subpoenas, warrants, etc., and bring in that information and bring in that data. We have a law enforcement response team who at the end of that will work with those investigators, understand what they're looking for, look into the data that is potentially available from our end, and then obviously legally share that back with those investigators. So with regards to that, then all of that information, it comes in, and our law enforcement response team and our global investigation team will look at all of that and see what we can do to assist those investigators with whatever has happened potentially on our platform, whether that's on the Eat side or the Ride side, or even in our freight business. Obviously, the whole purpose of this is to keep a safe platform and to understand exactly what is going out there, and making sure that whether that's someone taking a trip or ordering food, the safety is paramount to that experience. From the tech part, I think it's important to sort of go through and give you a better understanding of what we as a company have tried to do to bring together those sort of public and private partnerships, and to look at the unique ability that we've got to, as I say, help disrupt trafficking in some shape or form. And so since 2015, we have partnered with several leading organizations across the world, including ECPAT USA, Sintrata in South America, Polaris in the US, and then here in Canada, the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking. Most recently, we struck up a collaboration partnership with Truckers Against Trafficking in US and Canada. And basically what we're doing is looking to be guided by experts to see what we can do, and see whether or not we can play a part in educating people better, looking at the resources, looking at the sort of mobilization of the communities in which we're operating, to sort of raise awareness and give our drivers, our couriers, as much information as possible about trafficking, and give them that opportunity to know who to contact if they believe that they've witnessed something that is, as I say, affected them in a trafficking perspective. Now, in 2016, Uber signed the ECPAT, the Code, an industry-driven set of guidelines focused on the travel and tourism industry and companies preventing sexual exploitation and trafficking of children. We then went forward and started to work with Sintrata, as I mentioned, in South America. And with them, we've developed a series of podcasts, videos, and have delivered in-person trainings to our drivers, where we have proactively reached out to them, asked them to come into our green light hubs, which are places where they can come and speak to Uber representatives, and to discuss any incidents that they may have to do with trafficking. We're trying to drive that awareness and trying to basically encourage them to report any trafficking that they suspect has been happening in their vehicles. That led to a shortlist for the Thomson Reuters Stop Slavery Award back in 2019. And then from there, what we have tried to do is to look more deeper into the data and to do a research project to measure the effectiveness of digital anti-human trafficking campaigns that we've pushed out across couriers and drivers in Mexico. The results of this project will be released soon, but I think it's a fantastic example of looking at the tech, looking at the data, seeing at which ways we can reach out and connect with our actual drivers on the platform, and then learn and understand in what ways we can, again, help to give them more awareness about trafficking. With Polaris, we have created a video that is there and available for all drivers and delivery people, for them to look at and watch whenever they got that opportunity, and gives them a better understanding of what to expect when you call the human trafficking hotline. That's what we're trying to do, is to encourage them to call these hotlines, to call the tip lines, speak to NGOs, law enforcement, and make sure that they are able to actually give over that information and pull it all together. What we will obviously find is that some of these drivers and couriers don't always do that. They don't always reach out down those avenues, and they will reach out to us directly. If that happens and we are alerted to a potential trafficking situation, then we will look at it from our global investigations team's perspective, from my perspective, and then look at who we can reach out to within the law enforcement world, etc., to potentially proactively report this. So we're kind of like looking at the data both ways, whether that's coming in from the law enforcement world or from the actual drivers who are out there seeing things, hearing things. We have worked very closely with the attorneys generals in various states in the US ahead of big things like the Super Bowl, for any big events where we may be potentially involved in moving people and there could be a relevant link to human trafficking. We again have made sure that we've put on these driver awareness sessions in partnership with NGOs and with local law enforcement to again just raise the awareness and to sort of leverage the data that might be there and the technology and the opportunity that we have in order to touch base with all of those people who are actually out on the ground, potentially involved in helping to disrupt this. Finally, the UNODC, we've partnered with them and worked very closely with them on the July the 30th World Day Against Trafficking in Persons. We have, again, this year pushed out, we will be pushing out material in Canada and then South America, just reminding those drivers of exactly what they should be doing if they believe that someone is potentially involved in trafficking. We can do that via emails. We can use our app to send the messaging directly on the actual app, which they can look at whenever they've got a moment to sort of look into the actual information that's available. They can do that. So again, I think I'm trying to answer your question there. The technology that we've got available to us as a transportation company is huge, and we're doing our best, we believe, in order to partner with the right people to push out that messaging in the right places.
It's very, very interesting, Nick. I love the idea of learning from different partners of what might be available and what might be useful, especially from the technology perspective. And I know from my own experience, I've learned an awful lot from our NGO partners who've deep expertise in this issue. Next, I'd like to turn to Rebecca Listarten. So Rebecca has been working in the anti-trafficking field for the last 10 years, although you never know it when you see her. She is currently the Director of Operations for Stop the Traffic, and she oversees the global operations of Stop the Traffic's prevention programs. Now, prior to this, Rebecca worked in a multitude of global rescue and prevention programs, including as the operational manager to the UK's largest provision of support to survivors group, supporting thousands of individuals who have been trafficked globally and in the UK. Becca, it's always a pleasure talking with you and learning more about the NGO perspective. Can you share some background on the importance of technology in your current role with Stop the Traffic, and also perhaps you could reference back to how technology and data was used in your previous roles working with survivor support and in global rescue and prevention programs?
Thank you so much, Don. It's always lovely to speak to you as well and to everyone here. on the call. So as John mentioned, I oversee Stop the Traffic's global prevention programs, and to put it simply, we're helping people to understand what human trafficking is, how it affects them, and most importantly, what they can do about it, whether they are an individual, whether they're somebody already facing exploitation, or a financial institution, or a business. We come alongside them to help them ask questions of the data that we're seeing and how they can apply that into real life action that really has an impact. Data isn't just kind of a branch to what we do, it's definitely the engine. There's no piece of work that I oversee or that the fantastic team works on that isn't driven by data. Data shows us where trafficking is happening, how it's happening, and what we can do about it. And we use data, one, to spot financial transactions that we can come alongside a financial institution to help them read that context that Rob spoke about earlier. Or maybe perhaps we're reaching a vulnerable community, and we always aim to work with a community, not to a community. So the data that they bravely share with us really informs the work that we do. We recently had some feedback from somebody, that volunteers of us, that said when they saw one of the communications we put out, they said, that's my story. And doing that globally is impossible without data, because we're operating with different forms of trafficking in different global regions. So data is the complete engine, and our work wouldn't be possible without something like the Traffic Analysis Hub. If I reference how I use data before coming into a prevention organisation such as Stop the Traffic, I'm probably going to have to name and shame myself somewhat, because as we heard at the beginning in that video with Roberto, I hope you can tell I wasn't born in the 1970s, but I'm definitely familiar with the competitive and frustrating model of how NGOs might interact with each other, and this sense that if we share data, we're going to somehow lose our IP or some of the value that we hold as an NGO, and sometimes a sense of the survivors and the people with lived experience that we worked with were our survivors, and therefore their stories belong to us as an organisation. And what I truly believe is that survivors own their stories. And so at Stop the Traffic, what I now do is kind of translate the learning that I've had now back to frontline organisations, because when I look back at some of the decisions I made, some of the programmes I worked on, I can't believe I did it without big data, and I can't believe I did it without something such as the Traffic Analysis Hub. And so now we're looping NGOs into things like the Traffic Analysis Hub. We're using something called Power of 10, which is an initiative that we're running with Traffic Analysis Hub, with the Mekong Club, and with the Noble. And it's essentially demystifying data. As an NGO in the frontline space, I used to feel I gave a lot of data into research projects, into questionnaires, into different initiatives, and it was a bit of a, just went off into a black hole. I didn't really know what happened to it. And so really trying to show how data's cleaned, how it's analysed, and how it can be used. We're hearing back so much feedback from those frontline NGOs about ways that they're applying it that I definitely can't take credit for, because I hadn't even thought of it until we went on this journey with them. We've got almost 20 NGOs sharing into the initiative, and in the first 6 months we've got over 140 survivor stories, which I hope that people on this call can appreciate. There's a massive amount of stories that just otherwise would have been kept in a system that then isn't accessible to law enforcement, to us as a prevention organisation, or to rescue organisations who operate in the same space. So they're sharing in, and the ways that they're using it are amazing. So they're now delivering training and putting big data behind them. They're thinking about where they plant safe houses by using big data, and it's opening up this kind of collaborative conversation, and that actually we can share data and each be better at what we do because we're sharing data, whether we're prevention or rescue. That data enables us to ask different questions and come up with different solutions. And I truly believe in it as a tool for survivor empowerment. I was quite nervous to show the tool to some of the survivors I'd worked with before, because I worried it would feel not as human as some of the interactions I'd had. But I was completely blown away by their feedback. I had feedback of them saying, I don't feel alone when I look at this data, because I realise this is something that happens on a global scale, and that each of these data points represents somebody that was safe enough and brave enough to share their story. And I think we can't have conversations about data and financial transactions over here and data about survivor engagement over here. They are the same conversation, and the TA Hub for me symbolises those two things together, and it's just about the questions that we ask of it. So yeah, when I look back now, there's lots of learning, and I just see my role as translating that back to say, don't do what I did, come and look at the hub. It can really improve what you do and how you do it.
Thanks, Rebecca. It's always reassuring to hear that the hub and the data in the hub is useful and is important. And I know some of the unique data we have comes from the NGO community. It's the stuff that's not necessarily publicly available. And I think that's really the value in some of the data we have in the Trafficking Hub. Next, I'd like to turn to Larry Cameron. So Larry is the Chief Information Security Officer at the Anti-Human Trafficking Intelligence Initiative. And he's also an OSINT investigator for the National Child Protection Task Force. Larry has over 20 years of experience in the technology industry, and in his career, he's gained over 50 industry and IT security certifications. And his certifications include, and this is the big test for me, the tongue twisters, digital evidence investigator, mobile device investigator, triage investigator, certified cryptocurrency investigator, CipherTrace certified examiner. He manages technology in multiple disciplines and works with local, state, federal, and international law enforcement and human trafficking and child exploitation investigations. Welcome, Larry. I've been very fortunate to have had the opportunity to see how your organization, the Anti-Human Trafficking Intelligence Initiative, use technology to source and analyze data from many diverse sources. Many of those sources are not in the public domain. May I ask you to share maybe some of the work that you guys have done, especially in the area of child exploitation?
Yes, thanks, John, and good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. So I'll go a little about, go over our dark web intelligence system. So when we initially started collecting data, it was really difficult to find anything relating to child. So we had to kind of get a little innovative. You don't really want to search it because that's a little risky too. So what we've found is that majority of blockchain forensics companies did have data surrounding child exploitation and the sale of child abuse material. So that was pretty much where we started, is collecting that type of data. We also collect other financial type data that goes into compliance systems and financial institutions. So our data set includes a lot of PII, including businesses, names, phone numbers, email addresses, civic addresses, and we do a lot of open source intelligence and investigation on that data. But I think it was until we started analyzing the blockchain data that we really found out that most of this stuff does occur on the dark web. So we kind of had to bridge the gap there. So what we do is we ingest dark websites, we collect all the data out of it. We kind of mimic the advanced investigative techniques for things like a welcome to video. It was a really large child abuse website on the dark web. It had around 250,000 different videos. But the way that was taken down is they actually found an IP address in the website code. So we built that into Hades to automatically look for IP addresses. And we took the blockchain success that we had, and we started integrating various blockchain forensics apps into our dark web intelligence platform. Some of the things that we have success with were different meta tags, favorite icons. We were even able to find some Google Analytics tags on the dark web, which then allowed us to pivot from the dark web to the public internet. And also email addresses, we were able to run quite a bit of open source intelligence on them and find lots of information about those adversaries. SSH keys, we're able to link multiple different servers together by the people who administer them. For JavaScripts, we're able to figure out probably 10% of the dark web uses the same payment system in order to generate QR codes. Now, we have about 70,000 different sites ingested, but about 40,000 of those are online right now. So we're talking about 4,300 that use the same payment system. So it's a lot of insights you can get from data analytics. We even started using image hashing now. Last night, I found 433 sites linked together by the same 5 hashes. And, that's basically one case. Chances are they're the same organizations doing that. They're just popping up a whole bunch of servers. I found some other ones that around 1,000 different dark websites linked by the same email address. And we use a lot of that in order to de-anonymize people on the dark web. We even use advanced location intelligence, where we can pinpoint a server accurate to 1 meter, the exact location. So we use device data. So we take this device data, we run the IP through, we will get all the devices in that vicinity. Some of those devices can be submitting GPS coordinates. You can tell the SSID they're connecting to for Wi-Fi. Sometimes their MAC address. There's tons of insights you can get out of this. But, the challenge surrounding data is that it's kind of hoarded into many different silos, and there's so much duplicated effort. So this leads to greater opportunities to forge new relationships, increase the effectiveness of each other's programs while reducing the workload on the organizations. We started farming out our data in order to get stuff done about it. You can't have so much evidence and keep it to yourself. You need to report it to law enforcement. You got to report it to NCMEC and other organizations like that. We're not just doing dark web and blockchain forensics. We're doing digital forensics, financial intelligence. We're also trying to merge all of this data sets. There's probably about 7 different data silos that we're trying to merge together into data analytics in order to, get new insights. And I find collaboration is key if you want to succeed in today's competitive landscape. Again, our dark web intelligence platform, it's used by law enforcement agencies, NGOs, financial institutions, crypto exchanges. We're also taking that data and get it attributed in multiple different blockchain forensics applications, which I find is really important. To them, it's their lifeblood. This is how they make a living. They sell their product and they have this attribution. But if you don't have this attribution, none of their customers know that, what's actually occurring with that cryptocurrency. So again, a lot of the times it is child exploitation. It could also be drugs, weapons, criminal activities, mixers or washers, or, you can find pretty much everything, gambling. But I think the technology industry is what I would call the most innovative industry, and new developments happen at a really exceedingly fast pace. And again, this is where a lot of the data analytics comes in, but the situations are so complex in each geography with so many factors that it's difficult to know where to start. And as we start to understand the issue, the traffickers are going to be thinking of new opportunities to increase their criminal proceeds. So they're constantly evolving, and so should we. So that's where I think we should all join together and start fighting this scourge, especially related to children, because a lot of them, they don't have a voice, and they grew up like this.
Yeah, that's very powerful, Larry. And just on, you mentioned earlier the ability to mine lots of personal information and sensitive information in the work that you do. Now, I just want to talk about challenges a little bit. So I'm going to ask each person in turn to reference this a little bit. But one of the main challenges that we often hear in this industry is the inability for us to share PI and SPI data broadly across jurisdictions and across organizations. And very often that's the most effective piece of data, or most useful piece of data for investigations. How have you overcome that challenge in your work?
Well, the data we collect, it's open source intelligence. So it's collected from public sources. So if it's on the internet already, if you collect it, where's the legality there? We provide it to financial institutions. Lots of other companies provide it to financial institutions, whether it's sanctions, watch lists, politically exposed persons. There's dozens of data sets that all has PII in it. We're not doing anything different. Plus, we provide that data to law enforcement. So, you know, it's not like we're posting on the internet, hey, look at this. But, you know, that's kind of how we get around it. I mean, it's out there. If anybody wants to go get this data, they can.
And maybe the same question to Valisi. Valisi, from the Interpol perspective, you know, is it a myth that it's difficult or prohibitive to share PI and SPI data? Is that one of the big barriers to using technology effectively for law enforcement?
John, for Interpol, we have the mandate to store data related to criminal activities, especially on those type of crimes. In our 194 countries, they are able to share that through secure platforms that we have. So what I would say, it's especially on the law enforcement side, it's not about sharing the data, but how do we make an effective use of it? Really, I think that's the main challenge. We see some very good examples. We have countries, for example, that they use our databases on convicted criminals, traffickers, for example, and they can cross-check that against passenger lists on real time. So they can potentially identify traffickers, potential victims on real time. But the challenge is how we make sure we can develop that on countries where they're still struggling to have the technology, the infrastructure in place. So I wouldn't say it's a challenge, more challenging to share, but really how do we make an effective use of it?
Okay, very, very interesting. Thanks, Valisi. Nick, from an Uber perspective, aside from the PI, SPI challenges, what other opportunities might there be for technology from your perspective for us to leverage it more effectively in this battle?
I think from my perspective and in my experience in working in this field for the last 5 or 6 years or so, it's a lot about the collaboration, the working together, the introductions between private companies, I guess the public world, the understanding of what types of businesses those companies are in, whether or not that's the transportation sector, the tourism sector. I'm thinking about Uber to Airbnb, to Western Union, to Facebook, all of these organizations there, in being able to actually see what they've got available to them, to understand that, and then to sort of develop those relationships. And I think from my experience in working with law enforcement and understanding what challenges they've got, yeah, it's about seeing those investigations that they may have, understanding what data we may hold as a company, and then potentially making sure that those law enforcement agents know about what other data other companies may have, and if whether or not they're able to share that as well. And I'm just thinking from certainly from an Airbnb's perspective, for example, lots of investigations that have come through to us have been connected to other companies such as Airbnb or other hotels or other industries. And it's about making sure that, that information is available to the investigators for them to be aware of, that they know how they can reach out to those companies and potentially work with them on those investigations.
Really good. Yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of interesting conversations with different industry sectors around technology use and, different use cases for the technology, which is kind of an eye-opener for all of us. Rebecca, I'm thinking of the Power of 10 data and some of the NGO data that you Stop the Traffic have access to. What kind of approaches or opportunities are there for disrupting recruitment or the manipulation of the victims at source? And how do you guys approach that kind of challenge?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think in terms of how we approach it, I think the thing that has to stay central to this is the trust that's needed to hear from people what they're experiencing on the ground. When people share their story, they're not sharing their shopping list, they're sharing the thing that's a super tough thing, that's a journey that they've been on. And I think the hub provides a real space for that to be honoured, where they don't have to be platformed if they don't want to, and they don't have to retell their story to the law enforcement person looking at it, the researcher looking at it, or us as Stop the Traffic looking at it, looking at what the contextual information of what they're being offered is. And there's no other way for us to globally go into a community and work with them to understand, well, what type of job offer are they being offered? How much money are they being expected to pay? What might that false contract look like? What might they say to convince them? What type of threat might they receive? It would be literally impossible to do that without a shared data source that gives us that information. So I think that's the real opportunity, and that's what Stop the Traffic does. We look at those trends, we look at those hotspots, and we go work with that community to say, this is what it might look like for you, and then connect them to one of our amazing global partners to say, now you know about it, here's an alternative, because sometimes it isn't enough to know that you're at risk. You need an alternative option if you have those vulnerabilities in place. And I think the other opportunity is the community around the hub, because it's about connecting that feedback loop. So you've shared your story, and often you share it and you have to share it with law enforcement or an employer or your caseworker, and there's always some sort of something in the balance for the survivor. Whereas there's a loop of a community who might be able to say, because I knew how trafficking happened in this remote village in Albania, we were able to disrupt this gang, or we were able to remove these proceeds of crime. And if there's a way that survivors can tap into that and know that they had a part in stopping it happen to somebody else, that is when this will snowball, because a lot of the survivors we worked with really wanted to share what had happened to them, to stop it happening to others from their community, but they didn't feel there was a safe place for them to do that. And I think that's the essence of the opportunity that the hub provides.
Thanks, Rebecca. Unfortunately, I think time has beaten us. We could certainly continue these discussions for many more minutes, but it just leaves me to say a big thank you to all of our panelists today, Rebecca, Larry, Nick, and Valdeci. Thank you so much. I'll hand over now to Neil for some closing remarks.
Thank you, John. There are a couple of questions that we certainly picked up during the course of the conversations that I'd just like to reflect back to the panelists and see if you have a view. And one particularly perhaps is one for Matt Friedman to begin with. How might the public health perspective give us a different perspective here? Does it have relevance to the issue of human trafficking, and what might the strengths and weaknesses of using it be?
When I was working for the United Nations a few years back, we set up a sentinel surveillance mechanism whereby the government of Thailand would kind of repatriate about 450 people a day, which is a population of around 100,000 people. And then we were on the Cambodia side. We did kind of a random sample that was statistically significant. And as a result of this process, came to realize that 23% of the people who were in this situation would have been identified as human trafficking victims if somebody had asked them. Sentinel surveillance is very much a public health type mechanism. We adapted it and adopted it for this particular approach, and it allowed us to measure something that hadn't been measured. We also had a contest where we went and asked organizations that did quantitative work to submit proposals to us to come up with innovative ways of measuring modern slavery. And out of the 10 or so submissions, we picked 3 of them, we launched them, and most of them were based on public health as well. In fact, one of them was from Johns Hopkins University. The point is that there are ways of measuring something like modern slavery. For years, we've been hearing that human rights has to be qualitatively measured or analyzed. It's not so. There's tremendous amounts of data. The data can be used, it can be applied, and it can basically help us to identify what we need to know to fight modern slavery.
Thanks, Matt. Anybody else got a perspective from the panels, both panels? Okay, I tend to agree, just for the purposes of closing out this conversation, that we should not move away from any particular approach until we can show that it doesn't have value. And quite clearly, multiple approaches have value, but all of them rely upon data and insights. I made a note of something Rob Wainwright said earlier. All sectors have an opportunity to leverage the insights, and if we don't leverage the insights, we fail our communities. Second question that I've got here is, how does the intelligence community raise consumer awareness of human trafficking in supply chains without offending the commercial sectors we're trying to work with in order to undermine traffickers' opportunity to create products in those supply chains? Anyone got a view?
I'd just like to say one thing about the fact that the private sector actively and aggressively looks at their supply chains. They recognize the business risk associated with that. Despite the consumer perspective that the private sector would use slavery for stakeholder or for profits and so forth, it's just not the case. They have been addressing modern slavery through audits for 35 years. They've, on tier 1 of manufacturing, really made a significant difference. So, I mean, I think there are bad things that happen in the private sector. We all know that, but at the same time, I don't think we value enough the positive things that the private sector contributes in the fact that they have amazing data that, if it was available and able to be analyzed and put into something like the TA Hub, would add significant value. But for that to happen, there has to be a lot more trust.
Any other perspectives from panel members?
Neil, I'd jump in there and first of all thank Matt for the recognition of the work that the private sector does. We're often unsung in the work that we do to tackle organised crime. But a couple of sort of real life examples of how financial institutions actively engage. One of our clients, for example, was subject of some adverse media reporting that labour was being exploited, workforce human rights were being abused, and it ranged from this was in an African country, in a cement factory, in a cement producing factory, and this ranged from no toilet facilities to inappropriate sleeping facilities, inability for people to take a shower, right the way through to not being paid and being beaten on occasions. And our first reaction was to work with the client to see what we could do to tackle it, and we placed certain restrictions on and conditions on their continued relationship with us, and they needed us and our financial partnership to continue their business. And I'm happy to say that we developed an action plan with that entity. It's fair to say they didn't really consider that what they were doing was either that unusual in that country or even that particularly sinister. But when we pointed out that it didn't meet our standards, we were able to work with them and significantly improve the working conditions of those employees. So, you know, a lot goes on behind the scenes as well as what you see, at face value. So, private sector does do an awful lot.
Thanks, Nick. That's really insightful. I'm a great believer in following the pathway to remediation conversations because I think that has the ability to ensure people keep employment but get properly remunerated and looked after. One last question from the crop. This is largely pointed at the second panel, and it starts with Becca. You talked about the importance of a survivor-led approach. What do you think the biggest barriers to survivors and those who work with them sharing their stories are, and how can they be overcome?
Big question. I think the biggest barrier is about trust. It's about knowing where that story is going. It's demystifying data sharing, and it's not having these conversations in silos. So touching on the great work we talked about business sectors and financial institutions doing, how they use survivor data, having those case studies will greatly impact a survivor wanting to share their story in. And then also demystifying this for NGOs. As a frontline NGO, this was not on my agenda. I only thought about data when I was submitting a report, but how we can really get those user cases for how data is used by a frontline NGO and let them lead others. That's what we've seen in the Power of 10. It's no longer the original people saying, come and do this. It's spreading with those frontline organisations telling others, hey, if data was useful for me, this is how I used it. That carries so much more weight than it coming from people potentially in a different space to them, because they can relate. So I think the challenge is about trust and understanding the full loop of how data can be used. And I think the way to overcome it is by showing real life examples and removing all the jargon from the conversation.
Thanks, Becca. Anyone else just want to jump in on that one? I'll take that as a no. Okay, we're pretty much at the end. I made some just one-liner notes that I'd just like to reflect back to you quickly, if I might. Matt told us about the levels of accountability that there are in this space at the moment, with less than 1% of survivors being assisted and less than 1% of people being prosecuted, the perpetrators, of course. Nick, talking about the money hits the bank at some point. It's usually where the banks are most vulnerable. We need to change that, of course. Megan said, apart from telling us about the cost of risk, which I encourage you all to read, there's a link in the chat, but she said, I don't believe we have a sense of just how enormous this is. I think that's worth paying attention to. Yeah, Theresa told us that global action, when it's coordinated, there's a home for the insights that we derive from the work that we're doing there. And Valdesi talking to us about countries with traditionally high levels of human trafficking and exploitation tend to have poor data, and the TA Hub is beginning to fill that gap somewhat. We need to push on from that. And last but not least, survivor narratives equal survivor empowerment. If we get that right, and we have to prove we can be trusted and we have integrity, I hope that we'll continue to do that. We will keep showing up. I am fortunate to know professionally and personally all of the people that have played a part in this first conference this afternoon. It is a great privilege to know such brilliant people, and I'm greatly blessed by that. I also have a really good team. Alana, Henry and Kath, who kept this thing going, I am very thankful for. I wish I could give you the rest. Yeah, take the rest of the day off. And I'd just like to thank each and every one of you. We have 220 people on the call at one point, and I am massively grateful for your interest. If you want to ask more questions of us, you know where to find us. We will be back next year with more insights. In the meantime, keep sharing, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.